Hey everyone, it's Mikki here. You're listening to Mini Mikkipedia on a Monday, and today I want to chat about one of my favourite topics, walking. So, first up, I want to discuss walking in a couple of different contexts because I think that it's important to look more broadly at exercise, not just from a fat loss perspective, not just from a health perspective, but just looking at sort of variations of how you might recommend someone go about their plan around walking. I guess that's a good way to sort of put it. You guys know I'm a huge fan of activity in general, and it was interesting actually a few weeks ago, it blew up on the internet that Dr. Gabrielle Lyon suggested that walking in itself wasn't exercise. And as per usual, it came out of a clip of a podcast she did with, I think, Jocko. And as per usual, I think it was taken out of context because a lot of the criticism around her saying that was this idea that, of course, walking counts as exercise and don't go be dismissive of people who use exercise as their walking activity. If it's all they can do, it is amazing, and basically don't throw shade on that group of people. However, I went and I listened to the interview actually, and as per expected, because I did expect this was the case, what Dr. Lyon actually said was walking in itself isn't exercise the way that resistance training is exercise. And whilst her and Jocko, I think it was Jocko, agreed that walking was a great place for someone to start, it shouldn't really be the place that they finish, in that it's not the place that they stay. Walking is an excellent way to increase your non-exercise activity. So the amount of activity you do in everyday life outside of structured exercise. Walking is great for blood flow. It is great for increasing energy expenditure. It certainly has a place in a fat loss plan outside of structured exercise. And I say this because so often people who embark on fat loss or not, but just do their usual activity. They're up in the morning, they're at F45, they are doing their swim. But then outside of that active session, even if they do a couple of doubles, which I know plenty of endurance athletes do this, they aren't really active for the rest of the day. And that in itself has been associated with poor health outcomes, the prolonged sedentary behaviour. And if you think about our lives, right? For example, today I went out for a run, was about 15K. I did about 15,000 steps. That in itself would be plenty on a day that I didn't run. Like, that is me absolutely overachieving on my steps. It would have meant that I had been completely deliberate about going for walks around the block, making sure I was active most hours, and I didn't spend too much time sitting down. However, if I just do the 15K in an hour and a half run, then it does mean that for the rest of the day, I'm most likely sitting down for a large number of those hours. So I came back from my run this morning, had a couple of client calls, then I had breakfast, then I did some podcast work, answered some emails, and that was about 4 or 5 hours where I was really just sitting down. And that's the kind of prolonged sedentary behaviour that walking protects you against. And it also has implications for your overall energy expenditure. So if you are someone who is interested in improving body composition, you're in a calorie deficit, you're trying to lose body fat, you absolutely need to increase the amount of energy that you expend in a day to help with that calorie deficit. And when you are dieting, you naturally want to be a little bit lazier because your body does go into a little bit of a conservation mode where it'll try and save as much energy as possible. And this is not even something you're necessarily cognizant of, but you just feel a bit lazier. You can end up doing less because there are less calories going in. And so this conservation mode that your body is trying to fight against or is trying to hold on to is the thing that's preventing you from being motivated to be more active. And that's another reason why walking and making a deliberate decision to get up and be active during the day is super important. I often recommend that clients, and these are people who are otherwise active or and I'll get to the more sedentary people in a minute actually, but with those people, I would say that outside of your activity, try to aim for about 7,000 steps. Now look, if you're out on the weekend doing like a long training run, 3, 4, 5 hours in the mountains, or you're, on your bike for 6 hours or whatever, sure, do not worry about the number of steps you take on that day. But that is a minority of the population. So that's not really who I'm talking to for those specific people on those specific days. And absolutely, if we look at someone who commutes using their bike as opposed to walking, then that commute time is definitely going to transfer and have the same benefits as that low level sort of walking will. So I'm not suggesting that your commute to work isn't nearly as beneficial as going for a walk is, but just have a think about how active you actually are in everyday life. You could even do a little audit or a little tally to figure out whether or not most of your steps come in your activity or whether you're getting adequate steps across a day. So outside of your activity, I do suggest around 7,000. I don't think you have to go balls to the wall and aim for like 20,000 steps a day or anything like that. But I also know there are people who absolutely get that no problems at all, given the nature of their jobs. So it's by no means a bad thing. But if you're struggling to get your steps in, even starting at that sort of 7,000 is probably a good place to aim. Now, if I think about walking for cardiovascular disease perspective, I think this is super interesting actually. So I was looking at a study that was recently published and reported on, and it was a study looking at the impact of physical activity and the number of steps it takes to be protective from a cardiovascular disease risk factor. And what I will also state from a cardiovascular or a disease risk perspective is that leading a sedentary lifestyle, which is actually defined as taking fewer than 5,000 steps per day, is significantly associated with an increased risk of mortality from various causes, including CVD, cancer, plus also a higher risk of type 2 diabetes. And some people actually call sedentary behaviour a disease itself. Insufficient levels of activity affect over a quarter of the population in the Western world and is more pronounced among women compared to men, and also in high-income countries compared to low-income countries, which isn't surprising given the lifestyles that we lead. There have been studies looking at step counts and overall mortality and morbidity, and there are recommendations, for example, from the Centers of Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, of about 10,000 steps per day. In fact, though, even before the pandemic, which really amplified the problem with sedentary behaviour, step counts in countries like the States, the UK and China were well below the recommendation of 10,000 steps. There is research showing that the number of daily steps actually can matter more than the intensity of exercise when it comes to all-cause mortality. And a higher step count is associated with lower all-cause mortality, which just means death from all causes. But the intensity of the steps didn't really impact that relationship. So when they look at studies that measure steps and look at all-cause mortality and those diseases which I was talking about, there's this one that I'm looking at now, this meta-analysis, which actually looked at 17 cohort studies, which equates to almost or over 220,000 individuals, which were followed up for around 7 years. With 10 of these studies reported all-cause mortality and 4 focused on cardiovascular disease mortality. And so they looked at the number of steps equated to a lower all-cause mortality and a lower cardiovascular disease mortality. What they found was that a 1,000 step increment correlated with 15% reduction in all-cause mortality, and a 500 step increment was linked to a 7% reduction in the risk of cardiovascular mortality, which might not really sound like a lot, but it actually, on a population level, these are pretty significant numbers. And indeed, this was found to be significant in this model. And what the researchers were able to do across these studies was look at defined targets for step count and what the relationship was between them. And they found that even from going from very sedentary to just 3,867 steps a day, so pretty inactive, you did get this incremental decrease in your overall disease risk state. This subsequently increased as they went up by either 1,000 or 500 steps. So their cutoffs they used was 3,867 steps, 5,537 steps, 7,370 steps, and 7,000 is often the sort of minimum step threshold given for fat loss, and as I was talking about earlier. And then there was also even more risk reduction when you were able to hit 11,529 steps. So across these 4 different steps, if you like, there was a strong risk reduction in both all-cause mortality and cardiovascular disease mortality. And they actually had, in this meta-analysis, and I'll include it in the show notes, there was, they included studies that looked at people who did over 20,000 steps a day. So they certainly looked sort of across the board. So I guess the major take home from a study like this really is that even slightly increasing your steps can have quite a profound impact on your cardiovascular disease risk and your risk from death from all causes. So do take heart in that. Like, if there's no way that your work and lifestyle at the moment can allow you to jump from about 3,500 steps a day to 11,000 steps a day, know that even trying to bump that up by 1,500 or even 2,000 will actually give you significant benefits in the long term with regards to your cardiovascular disease and all-cause mortality risk. And of course, if you were already at 5,000, then even going up to that sort of 7,370 is their cutoff, but over 7,000 steps, you'll continue to see a benefit with regards to those health outcomes. Beyond that 11,500 steps, you don't necessarily see an increased benefit with regards to the outcomes they were looking at, which was that all-cause mortality and reduced cardiovascular disease mortality. One other thing I will add to the overall sort of walking benefits of walking is, well, walking is great actually, and it's great for so many reasons. It's great for the benefits on energy expenditure. It's a great thing for your central nervous system. Just even leisure walking is fantastic to help with anyone who struggles with anxiety or has a lot of stress and they need to alleviate stress. Walking is fantastic, particularly walking in nature. This isn't just my opinion, by the way, like research shows us this, but it's also a great way to reduce your risk of all-cause mortality and cardiovascular disease mortality, and it doesn't really cost anything. So if you are lucky enough to be able to walk, then I would try to make time for that if you are currently not doing so. Someone did ask whether was it the day-to-day step count that mattered, or is it a little bit like you have a step budget per week, and as long as you hit those steps, that's what really matters? And what I do think is that from a weight loss perspective, I think the overall budget matters. So you can still see significant benefit if you are able to get in longer walks in the weekend, but you have to cut it a little bit short throughout the week. I think that's okay. And I think that's what the research shows us, in fact. However, from the benefit of not being physically inactive, I think trying to maintain some sort of baseline step count, even if it is that 5,000 steps throughout the week, I think that would also be beneficial. And even if you did it so you were getting up multiple times per day to get your steps in, I mean, that's a great way to try and fit them in, right? It would be remiss of me not to mention, however, that a few weeks ago, a study came out that showed that doing 10 squats every 45 minutes was as effective as going for a 10-minute walk on that postprandial blood sugar, which is blood sugar levels after a meal. And we know how intricately tied to overall health blood sugar is. So if you can't get out and walk, you probably can get up and do 10 squats, right? That's not necessarily the hardest thing for someone to do. And look, I'm being general here. There will be someone listening to this where it literally is impossible to do that, but I'm not talking to that person. I'm talking to the majority of us who just have to have it in their head that they want to do it and just have to prioritize that activity. So that's who I'm really speaking to here. So in summary, if fat loss is your goal, aim for 7,000 steps outside of that activity that you're already doing. Regardless of your goal, even shifting from 3,500 steps to 5,500 steps to 7,500 steps, and even up to 11,500 steps, you're going to see an incremental benefit with regards to your overall all-cause mortality and cardiovascular disease mortality. Every little bit counts. And finally, if literally you do not have time to be able to go for a walk during the day, do you have time to do 10 squats every 45 minutes? Because there are also significant health benefits from doing that. Anyway, food for thought. I hope that you at least got something from this that you can take heart in, or you can work towards, because that's also a really good thing as well. And I'll include the studies that I used that informed my opinion in the show notes, just in case you're interested. However, I'd love to chat to you about this, so why don't you head on over to Instagram, Threads, or Twitter at Mikki Williden, Facebook at Mikki Williden Nutrition, or head to my website, mikkiwilliden.com, and send me an inquiry through there. All right, team, have the best week. See you later.